The 28th Precinct Station House stood on West 123rd Street in Harlem, a four-story brick building constructed in 1901, when the neighborhood was still predominantly white and middle class. By March 1936, Harlem had been transformed by decades of black migration from the South, and the precinct served a community that police department leadership still approached with a mixture of indifference and hostility. The station house's architecture reflected the municipal authority it represented: heavy stone lintels over the windows, iron bars on the first floor, a broad entrance with worn granite steps where officers stood smoking during shift changes. On the afternoon of March 17, 1936, at approximately 2:30, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson walked up those granite steps and through the entrance of the 28th Precinct. He was 30 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, lean and muscular from years of physical work and street confrontations. He wore a dark suit of moderate quality, a white shirt, and a black tie. His shoes were polished leather. A bump on the back of his head, the result of a childhood injury, had given him the nickname by which everyone in Harlem knew him: Bumpy. Johnson entered the station house and approached the desk sergeant, a thick-necked Irish officer in his 50s, who sat behind a raised wooden desk near the entrance. Johnson stated that he needed to speak with Captain Michael Brennan about a matter concerning operations in the precinct. The desk sergeant looked at Johnson with the expression of someone accustomed to dismissing black residents who came to the station with complaints or requests, and the sergeant asked what specific matter Johnson wished to discuss. Johnson repeated that the matter concerned precinct operations, and that Captain Brennan would understand the significance once Johnson explained it to him. The desk sergeant told Johnson that Captain Brennan did not meet with neighborhood residents without appointments, and that in any case the captain was occupied with department business. Johnson said he would wait. The desk sergeant said there was no waiting area for civilians and suggested that Johnson leave and telephone for an appointment. Johnson remained standing at the desk, his posture upright but not aggressive, his expression neutral. The sergeant repeated more forcefully that Johnson needed to leave. Johnson stated again that his business concerned precinct operations and that the captain would want to be informed about it. The exchange attracted the attention of other officers in the station house. 3 patrolmen who had been standing near the entrance moved closer. The desk sergeant's tone became openly hostile. He told Johnson that colored residents who came into the station making demands did not receive favorable treatment, and that if Johnson did not leave immediately, he would be arrested for causing a disturbance. Johnson replied calmly that he had not raised his voice, had not made threats, and had simply requested to speak with the precinct captain about a matter of legitimate concern. The sergeant stood from his chair and leaned forward over the desk, his face reddening. He said that Johnson's reputation as one of Queenie Street Clare's thugs was well known to the precinct, that Johnson had no business making requests of police officers, and that if Johnson did not leave within the next minute, he would be thrown out bodily. Johnson stood silently for a moment, his face showing no reaction to the sergeant's words. The 3 patrolmen had positioned themselves near him, prepared to physically remove him if ordered. Johnson looked directly at the desk sergeant, then glanced at the patrolman, then back to the sergeant. He nodded once, turned, and walked out of the station house without speaking. Johnson descended the granite steps and walked east on 123rd Street toward Lenox Avenue. His gait was steady and unhurried. He did not look back at the station house, and he gave no visible indication of anger or frustration. To anyone observing him on the street, he appeared to be simply a man walking through the neighborhood on an ordinary afternoon. But Johnson was thinking methodically about what had just occurred and what it revealed. He had not gone to the 28th Precinct station on impulse. He had gone because he had learned information over the previous weeks that suggested Captain Michael Brennan was providing protection not just to Italian mob operations generally, which was common throughout the city, but was taking specific instructions from Lucky Luciano's organization about how to handle enforcement in Harlem, including instructions about how to pressure Stephanie St. Clair's numbers operations. Johnson had been St. Clair's chief enforcer for 5 years. He understood Harlem's illegal economy in detail. He knew which police officers accepted small payments to ignore specific violations, which officers took regular payoffs to provide comprehensive protection, and which officers actively participated in criminal operations. This knowledge was essential to surviving and operating in Harlem's underworld. What Johnson had learned about Captain Brennan exceeded the normal patterns of police corruption. Brennan was not simply accepting money to look the other way. Brennan was coordinating police actions with mob strategy. The information had come from multiple sources over several weeks. A patrolman who drank at a speakeasy that Johnson controlled had mentioned to a bartender that Captain Brennan was meeting regularly with Italian men who were not local business owners, and a numbers runner who had been arrested by Brennan's officers reported that during questioning they had asked specific questions about St. Clair's operation that could only have come from someone with inside knowledge of Italian mob interests. A woman who cleaned offices at the station house told her sister, who worked at a Harlem restaurant, that she had overheard Brennan on the telephone using phrases like "Mr. Luciano's concerns" and "what the organization wants done." Johnson had verified these reports through additional observation. He had watched Brennan leave the station house on 3 separate evenings and travel to an Italian restaurant on the Lower East Side, where he met with men Johnson recognized as Luciano associates. He had documented the times and dates, and he had confirmed that these meetings were not official police business. Brennan went alone, in civilian clothes, during off-duty hours. Johnson had gone to the station house that afternoon, intending to confront Brennan directly, to tell the captain that his relationship with Luciano's organization had been discovered, and to inform him that if Brennan continued to coordinate police actions against St. Clair's operations, that information would be made public. Johnson had expected that Brennan might be hostile or defensive, but Johnson had believed that the threat of exposure would be sufficient to make Brennan reconsider his cooperation with the mob. Instead, Johnson had not been allowed to reach Brennan. He had been dismissed by a desk sergeant who treated him with open contempt. That the message from the precinct was clear. A black man who worked in Harlem's illegal economy had no standing to make demands of police officers, no matter what information he possessed. Walking east on 123rd Street, Johnson recognized that the situation was more complex than he had initially assessed. The problem was not simply Captain Brennan's individual corruption. The problem was a system in which police officers could take orders from organized crime figures while simultaneously claiming authority to enforce laws, and in which anyone who tried to challenge that arrangement, particularly someone like Johnson who lacked social status or political protection, would be dismissed or threatened. Johnson understood that confronting Brennan directly would not work. because Brennan operated within an institutional structure that protected him. Now, the police department would not discipline an officer based on accusations from someone like Johnson. The department's leadership tolerated corruption as long as it remained discreet and did not create political problems. Brennan could continue taking orders from Luciano indefinitely unless something forced the department to address his conduct. Johnson needed to create conditions where Brennan's corruption became too visible, too politically sensitive, or too institutionally costly to ignore. This would require demonstrating Brennan's relationship with Luciano in ways that could not be easily dismissed, and doing so in contexts that would create pressure on the police department to act. Johnson could not accomplish this alone. He needed allies who could apply pressure from multiple directions: legal, political, public, and institutional. The first ally Johnson identified was Eleanor Whitmore, a 34-year-old attorney who practiced civil rights law in Harlem. Whitmore was one of the few black female lawyers in New York City, a graduate of Howard University Law School who had moved to Harlem in 1932 and had established a practice representing residents in cases involving police misconduct, housing discrimination, and criminal defense. Johnson had known Whitmore professionally for 2 years. She had represented some of St. Clair's employees when they were arrested on gambling charges. Whitmore disapproved of Johnson's criminal activities, but she also recognized that he was intelligent and strategic, and that he understood Harlem's power dynamics better than most people. Johnson met with Whitmore at her office on Lenox Avenue 2 days after his confrontation at the police station. He explained what he had learned about Captain Brennan's relationship with Luciano's organization. He provided dates, times, and locations of Brennan's meetings with mob associates. He described the specific police actions that appeared to be coordinated with mob interests: arrests of St. Clair's runners timed to coincide with Italian operations moving into specific territories, police raids on St. Clair's locations but not on comparable Italian-controlled locations, harassment of St. Clair's customers but not customers of Italian gambling operations. Whitmore listened carefully and asked detailed questions. She understood the implications. And a police captain taking orders from a mob boss represented not just individual corruption, but institutional failure. It meant that law enforcement was not serving the public, but was instead serving private criminal interests. It meant that police authority was being used as a weapon in mob conflicts rather than as protection for communities. Whitmore agreed to help, but she emphasized that challenging a police captain would require more than Johnson's testimony. The police department and the courts would not take seriously accusations from someone with Johnson's background. The challenge would need to come from sources that had institutional credibility: community leaders, elected officials, respected organizations. Whitmore's role would be to coordinate legal action and to provide documentation that could be used in formal proceedings, but the pressure would need to come from multiple directions. The second ally was Reverend Samuel Hayes, pastor of the Greater Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church on West 128th Street. Hayes was 52 years old, a graduate of Wilberforce University, a respected voice in Harlem's religious community who had led his congregation for 18 years. Hayes knew Johnson's reputation as an enforcer for St. Clair's numbers operation, and Hayes disapproved of illegal gambling as a matter of religious principle. But Hayes also knew that police corruption in Harlem was a serious problem that harmed the entire community, and he believed that challenging that corruption was more important than maintaining social distance from people involved in illegal activities. Johnson met with Hayes at the church rectory, and he explained what he had learned about Captain Brennan. He described how Brennan was using police authority to serve mob interests rather than community interests. He emphasized that Brennan's corruption represented a broader problem in which Harlem residents could not trust that police officers were serving legitimate law enforcement purposes rather than private criminal agendas. Hayes understood the significance. He agreed to raise the issue with other religious leaders in Harlem and to organize a campaign calling for investigation of police corruption in the 28th Precinct. Hayes emphasized that his involvement would be on behalf of the community's interests, not on behalf of Johnson or St. Clair personally. Johnson accepted this condition. The goal was not to protect St. Clair's operations, but to challenge police corruption that affected everyone in Harlem. The third ally was Arthur Thompson, a journalist who wrote for the Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black newspaper. Thompson was 38 years old, a graduate of Lincoln University, an experienced reporter who had covered Harlem politics and crime for 12 years. Thompson had written extensively about police corruption, including articles following the Seabury Commission's findings about police involvement in protecting illegal gambling operations. Thompson knew Johnson by reputation and had interviewed him once for a story about numbers operations in Harlem. Thompson viewed Johnson as a criminal, but also as someone who understood Harlem's power structures with unusual clarity. And Johnson met with Thompson at a coffee shop near the Amsterdam News offices. He provided Thompson with detailed information about Brennan's meetings with Luciano associates, including dates, locations, and the identities of the people Brennan met with. He explained the pattern of police actions that appeared to be coordinated with mob strategy. He offered to provide Thompson with access to additional sources who could verify the information. Thompson recognized this as a significant story. A police captain taking orders from Lucky Luciano would confirm what many Harlem residents suspected, that police corruption was not limited to individual officers accepting small bribes, but extended to systematic coordination between law enforcement and organized crime. Thompson said he would investigate the allegations and would publish a story if he could verify the facts independently. He emphasized that he would not rely solely on Johnson's claims, but would need corroboration from other sources. The fourth ally was Adam Clayton Powell, Sr., pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, the largest and most influential black church in Harlem. Powell was 71 years old, a towering figure in Harlem's religious and civic life, a voice that commanded respect from both the black community and white political leaders. Powell's son, Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., was already emerging as a political force and would later become the first black congressman from New York. The elder Powell had maintained a careful relationship with Harlem's illegal economy. He did not endorse criminal activity, but he also recognized that many of his congregants worked in or depended on the numbers, operations, and speakeasies that provided employment when legitimate opportunities were scarce. Johnson did not meet with Powell directly. Instead, Reverend Hayes approached Powell and explained the situation. Hayes described what Johnson had learned about Captain Brennan and the broader implications for police corruption in Harlem. Powell listened and agreed that the issue warranted attention from Harlem's religious leadership. Powell said he would raise the matter at an upcoming meeting of the Harlem Ministers' Alliance and would support calls for investigation of police conduct in the 28th Precinct. With these allies identified, Johnson developed a strategy for exposing Brennan's corruption and forcing him to choose between his relationship with Luciano's organization and his career as a police officer. The strategy had multiple components designed to create pressure from different directions simultaneously. First, Eleanor Whitmore would prepare a formal complaint documenting Brennan's corruption and file it with the police department's Internal Affairs Division and with the Office of the Manhattan District Attorney. The complaint would detail the meetings between Brennan and Luciano associates, the pattern of police actions that served mob interests, and the broader implications of a police captain coordinating law enforcement with organized crime. The complaint would be submitted not in Johnson's name, but in the name of the Harlem Community Legal Defense Fund, and an organization Whitmore had established to represent residents in civil rights cases. This would give the complaint institutional credibility rather than appearing to come from individuals involved in criminal activity. Second, Reverend Hayes would organize a series of community meetings at Greater Bethel AME Church to discuss police corruption in Harlem. These meetings would bring together residents who had experienced problems with the 28th Precinct, people who had been harassed, arrested on questionable charges, or subjected to excessive force. The meetings would document patterns of police misconduct and would build public awareness that the precinct's problems went beyond individual officers to systematic corruption. While Hayes would frame the issue as a civil rights matter, police corruption prevented Harlem residents from receiving equal protection under the law and undermined trust between the community and law enforcement. Third, Arthur Thompson would publish a series of articles in the Amsterdam News investigating police corruption in the 28th Precinct. The articles would not initially name Captain Brennan specifically, but would describe patterns of police conduct that suggested coordination with organized crime. Thompson would interview residents who had experienced problems with precinct officers. He would document the contrast between how police treated illegal gambling operations run by Italians versus operations run by black entrepreneurs. And he would raise questions about whether police captains were using their authority to serve public interests or private criminal interests. Fourth, Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and the Harlem Ministers' Alliance would issue a public statement calling for investigation of police corruption in Harlem, and specifically in the 28th Precinct. The statement would emphasize that police corruption harmed the entire community by preventing residents from trusting law enforcement and by allowing criminals to operate with official protection. The statement would call on the police commissioner and the mayor to investigate allegations of officers coordinating with organized crime figures. Fifth, Johnson would continue documenting Brennan's activities, gathering additional evidence of his meetings with Luciano associates and his coordination of police actions with mob strategy. This evidence would be provided to Whitmore, Thompson, and other allies as they developed their respective campaigns. Johnson would not appear publicly in any of these efforts. His role would be to supply information and to coordinate the overall strategy while others conducted the public-facing work. The strategy was designed to make Brennan's corruption increasingly visible and increasingly costly for the police department to ignore. If Brennan was protected by a single institutional layer, the precinct or the police department, that protection might hold. But if pressure came simultaneously from legal complaints, community organizing, media coverage, and religious leadership, the cumulative effect would force the police department to address the situation or face broader political consequences. The execution of the strategy began in early April 1936. Eleanor Whitmore filed the formal complaint with the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division and the Manhattan District Attorney's Office on April 6th. The complaint was detailed and specific. It identified Captain Michael Brennan by name and rank. It listed 10 separate occasions on which Brennan had met with known associates of Lucky Luciano's organization. It documented the dates, times, and locations of these meetings. It described specific police actions in the 28th Precinct that appeared to be coordinated with mob interests, raids on St. Clair's locations but not on comparable Italian operations, arrests of black numbers runners but not Italian numbers runners operating in the same territory, harassment of black business owners who refused to pay protection money to Italian organizations. The complaint argued that Brennan's conduct violated department regulations, undermined public trust in law enforcement, and represented criminal conspiracy between a police officer and organized crime figures. It requested that the department launch an immediate investigation, suspend Brennan pending that investigation, and review all of Brennan's actions as precinct captain to determine whether other misconduct had occurred. The Internal Affairs Division received the complaint and assigned it a case number. This was standard procedure. Most complaints filed with Internal Affairs resulted in perfunctory investigations that concluded with no action taken. But the complaint from the Harlem Community Legal Defense Fund was unusual because it came from an attorney, was documented in detail, and made specific allegations that, if true, would represent serious corruption. On April 12th, Reverend Hayes held the first community meeting at Greater Bethel AME Church to discuss police corruption in Harlem. Over 150 residents attended. Hayes opened the meeting by explaining that the church was providing a space for residents to share their experiences with the 28th Precinct and to discuss whether patterns of police misconduct suggested systematic problems rather than isolated incidents. One by one, residents described their experiences. A woman explained that she had been arrested for operating a numbers game in her apartment, but that Italian operators running larger numbers operations on the same block were never arrested. A man described being stopped and searched by precinct officers multiple times without explanation, while white residents in the same area were not subjected to similar treatment. A business owner explained that precinct officers had told him he needed to pay protection money to an Italian organization or face constant inspections and citations for minor violations. A mother described how her son had been beaten by precinct officers after being arrested for a minor offense. Hayes listened to each person and documented their accounts. He emphasized that individual incidents might reflect individual officers' misconduct, but that patterns across many residents' experiences suggested systematic problems. He noted that the precinct appeared to enforce laws selectively based on race and based on whether residents cooperated with organized crime figures. He argued that this violated fundamental principles of equal protection and undermined Harlem residents' trust in law enforcement. The meeting was covered by the Amsterdam News. Arthur Thompson attended and took notes. His article, published on April 15th, described the community meeting and quoted residents' accounts of police misconduct. The article noted that over 150 Harlem residents had gathered to discuss problems with the 28th Precinct and that their descriptions suggested patterns of selective enforcement and coordination with organized crime. The article quoted Reverend Hayes, calling for investigation of whether precinct leadership was directing officers to serve private criminal interests rather than public safety. On April 18th, the Harlem Ministers Alliance issued a public statement signed by Adam Clayton Powell Sr., Reverend Hayes, and 14 other prominent black ministers in Harlem. The statement expressed concern about police corruption in the 28th Precinct and called for investigation by the police commissioner and the mayor. The statement emphasized that police corruption harmed the entire community by preventing residents from trusting law enforcement and by allowing criminals to operate with official protection. The statement noted that Harlem residents deserved police services that served community interests rather than private criminal interests, and the statement was distributed to newspapers throughout New York City and was read aloud at churches across Harlem the following Sunday. The New York Times published a brief article about the minister's statement on April 20th, noting that Harlem religious leaders were calling for investigation of police corruption. Throughout this period, Johnson continued documenting Brennan's activities. On April 14th, he observed Brennan meeting with two men at an Italian restaurant on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan. Johnson recognized one of the men as Vito Genovese, a senior figure in Luciano's organization. The meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes. Brennan arrived in civilian clothes during evening hours when he was off duty. Johnson documented the date, time, location, and the identities of the people present. And he provided this information to Eleanor Whitmore, who included it in supplemental materials submitted to the Internal Affairs Division. On April 22nd, Arthur Thompson published a second article in the Amsterdam News investigating police corruption in the 28th Precinct. This article was more specific than the first. It described patterns of selective enforcement in which precinct officers raided black-owned gambling operations, but not Italian-owned operations. It noted that residents had reported precinct officers directing them to pay protection money to Italian organizations. It raised questions about whether precinct leadership was coordinating enforcement actions with organized crime figures. The article did not name Captain Brennan, but it described senior precinct officers who appeared to be making strategic decisions about enforcement that served mob interests. The article quoted law enforcement experts saying that such patterns suggested either corruption or extraordinary incompetence. The article noted that community leaders and attorneys had filed complaints with the police department and had called for investigation. These combined pressures, the formal complaint, the community meetings, the media coverage, the minister's statement, began to create political costs for the police department. The department's leadership could not easily dismiss allegations that were coming from multiple credible sources that were documented in detail and that were receiving public attention. The Internal Affairs Division, which typically conducted pro forma investigations, found itself under pressure to take the complaint against Brennan seriously. On April 28th, two Internal Affairs investigators interviewed Eleanor Whitmore about the complaint. They asked her to provide evidence supporting the allegations against Brennan. Whitmore provided documentation of Brennan's meetings with mob associates, including dates, times, locations, and the identities of the people present. She provided affidavits from Harlem residents describing selective enforcement patterns. She provided copies of arrest records showing that precinct officers arrested black numbers operators, but not Italian numbers operators working in the same territory. The investigators said they would review the evidence and would conduct their own investigation. They did not commit to any timeline or any specific actions, but the fact that they had requested detailed evidence suggested that the complaint was being taken more seriously than typical internal affairs investigations. On May 3rd, Reverend Hayes held a second community meeting at Greater Bethel AME Church. This meeting attracted over 200 residents. Hayes announced that the police department's Internal Affairs Division was investigating allegations of corruption in the 28th Precinct. He said that residents should document any experiences with police misconduct and should provide that information to attorneys and community organizations that could include it in formal complaints. The meeting discussed not just individual officers' misconduct, but the broader implications of police corruption. Residents described how police officers' cooperation with organized crime made Harlem less safe rather than more safe. Criminals who paid protection money to police could operate with impunity, while law-abiding residents received no police protection. Residents described how police corruption undermined economic opportunities. Small business owners who refused to pay protection money faced constant harassment from police, while businesses controlled by organized crime received police protection. On May 8th, Arthur Thompson published a third article in the Amsterdam News. This article focused specifically on Captain Michael Brennan. Thompson reported that his investigation had found evidence that Brennan met regularly with associates of Lucky Luciano's organization. Thompson described specific meetings, including dates and locations. Thompson noted that Brennan had been observed at Italian restaurants in Lower Manhattan, meeting with men identified by law enforcement sources as mob associates. Thompson reported that residents and community leaders had filed complaints alleging that Brennan coordinated police enforcement actions with mob strategy. The article created significant attention. Thompson had named Brennan publicly and had provided specific details that suggested serious corruption. The police department could no longer treat the allegations as vague complaints from disgruntled residents. The department faced questions from other newspapers about whether it was investigating Brennan and what actions it planned to take. Captain Brennan responded by issuing a statement denying the allegations. He said that he had devoted his career to law enforcement, that he had served honorably in the NYPD for 22 years, and that accusations of corruption were coming from criminals who resented his aggressive enforcement of gambling laws. He said that he occasionally had professional contact with individuals from various backgrounds as part of his law enforcement duties, and that such contact did not constitute corruption or conspiracy. He said that he looked forward to being vindicated by any investigation. Brennan's statement was published in several newspapers on May 10th, but the statement did not address the specific evidence that had been documented: the multiple meetings with mob associates during off-duty hours, the selective enforcement patterns, the coordination between police actions and mob interests. Brennan's generic denial did not match the detailed allegations that had been made. On May 15th, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office announced that it was opening an investigation into allegations of police corruption in Harlem. The announcement said that the district attorney had received complaints from community organizations and attorneys alleging that police officers in the 28th Precinct were coordinating enforcement actions with organized crime figures. The announcement said that the investigation would examine whether police officers had violated laws against official misconduct, criminal conspiracy, or other offenses. The announcement said that the district attorney's office would work with the police department's internal affairs division, but would also conduct independent investigation. This announcement represented a significant escalation. When only the Internal Affairs Division was investigating, the police department could control the process and the outcome, but when the district attorney's office was conducting an independent investigation, the department no longer had complete control. The district attorney could issue subpoenas, could compel testimony, and could bring criminal charges if evidence supported them. The announcement created immediate problems for Captain Brennan. He was still serving as commander of the 28th Precinct, but he was now the subject of a criminal investigation. His subordinate officers knew this, and some began to distance themselves from him. Officers who had previously followed Brennan's instructions about which gambling operations to raid and which to ignore now became cautious about following such instructions, recognizing that they might be implicated in corruption charges. On May 22nd, Brennan was called to meet with Deputy Police Commissioner for Legal Affairs. The meeting took place at One Police Plaza, the department's headquarters in Lower Manhattan. Brennan was informed that due to the ongoing investigation, he was being reassigned from command of the 28th Precinct to administrative duties at headquarters. The reassignment was described as temporary pending the outcome of the investigation, but everyone understood that it was effectively a demotion and a signal that the department was distancing itself from Brennan. Brennan protested that he had done nothing wrong and that the reassignment was premature. The deputy commissioner responded that the department needed to maintain public confidence in its operations, and that having a precinct commander under investigation by the district attorney's office undermined that confidence. The reassignment was not a judgment about Brennan's guilt or innocence, but a prudent step to protect the department's reputation while the investigation proceeded. Brennan left the meeting understanding that his position had become untenable. He had been removed from command. His career was effectively over, regardless of whether formal charges were filed. If the investigation concluded that he was guilty of corruption, he would be fired and likely prosecuted. If the investigation concluded that evidence was insufficient for prosecution, he would still be permanently stigmatized within the department as someone whose conduct had created political problems and embarrassment for the organization. Over the following weeks, the district attorney's investigation gathered evidence. Investigators interviewed Harlem residents about their experiences with the 28th Precinct. They reviewed arrest records and compared enforcement patterns against black-owned gambling operations versus Italian-owned operations. They subpoenaed Brennan's telephone records and bank records. They interviewed officers who had served under Brennan's command. The investigation found evidence that supported the allegations. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Brennan had met with Luciano associates on numerous occasions. Arrest records showed selective enforcement patterns that were difficult to explain through legitimate law enforcement rationales. Officers who had served under Brennan described receiving instructions to raid specific locations while avoiding other locations, and said these instructions appeared to be based on organized crime considerations rather than public safety considerations. But the investigation also found that proving criminal conspiracy would be difficult. Meetings between a police captain and mob associates, even if frequent and suspicious, did not by themselves constitute criminal conduct unless prosecutors could prove that Brennan had received money or other benefits in exchange for official actions. The selective enforcement patterns suggested corruption, but did not definitively prove it. Brennan could argue that he had made enforcement decisions based on legitimate considerations like resource allocation and strategic priorities. On June 18th, the district attorney's office issued a report on its investigation. And the report stated that investigators had found evidence of serious concerns about Captain Brennan's conduct and about enforcement patterns in the 28th Precinct during his command. The report stated that evidence suggested Brennan had maintained inappropriate relationships with organized crime figures and that enforcement decisions appeared to reflect improper considerations. However, the report stated that evidence was insufficient to support criminal prosecution at this time. The report recommended that the police department take appropriate administrative action based on the findings. This outcome was typical for investigations of police corruption. Prosecutors were reluctant to bring charges against police officers unless evidence was overwhelming, in part because juries were often unwilling to convict officers, and in part because the district attorney's office needed to maintain working relationships with the police department. Administrative action, disciplinary measures within the department, was more common than criminal prosecution. On June 25th, the police department announced that Captain Michael Brennan was retiring from the NYPD effective immediately. The announcement said that Brennan had chosen to retire rather than face disciplinary proceedings related to the investigation. The announcement said that Brennan's retirement was voluntary and that he would receive pension benefits consistent with his years of service. This was the standard face-saving arrangement for officers forced out due to misconduct. Brennan was not formally fired, and so he avoided the stigma and legal consequences of termination. But everyone understood that the retirement was involuntary. Brennan had been given a choice between retiring or facing formal disciplinary charges that would likely result in termination without pension benefits. For Brennan, the outcome meant the end of his career and reputation. He left the police department at age 52 after 22 years of service, under circumstances that made clear he had been forced out due to corruption allegations. He would receive his pension, but he had lost his position, his authority, and his standing within law enforcement. His name had been published in newspapers in connection with corruption charges. Former colleagues would not associate with him. Future employment opportunities would be limited because of the stigma attached to his departure. Brennan had been forced to choose between his relationship with Luciano's organization and his career as a police officer. When that choice became explicit, when continued cooperation with the mob meant inevitable career destruction, Brennan had chosen to leave the police department rather than face formal charges. But this choice came too late to save his career. The damage had already been done. For Johnson, the outcome represented a strategic victory achieved through systematic pressure rather than direct confrontation. Johnson had not personally destroyed Brennan's career. Johnson had created conditions where Brennan's corruption became politically visible and institutionally costly, forcing the police department and the district attorney's office to act. The pressure had come from multiple sources: legal complaints, community organizing, media coverage, religious leadership, each applying force from a different direction, creating cumulative effects that overcame the institutional protections that typically shielded corrupt police officers. The victory was significant because it demonstrated that even powerful figures operating within protective institutional structures could be held accountable when sufficient pressure was applied through legitimate channels. Brennan had believed he was protected by his rank, by the police department's institutional loyalty to its officers, and by the reluctance of prosecutors to charge police with crimes. But when his corruption became too visible and too politically sensitive, those protections evaporated. The broader impact of Brennan's forced retirement extended beyond the individual case. The 28th Precinct received a new commander who understood that he was being watched closely and that the community had demonstrated capacity to challenge police corruption. The new commander implemented changes in how the precinct handled enforcement of gambling laws, directing officers to focus on public safety considerations rather than on serving organized crime interests. Arrests of numbers operators became more consistent across racial lines. Harassment of small business owners who refused to pay protection money decreased. These changes were incremental rather than revolutionary. Police corruption in Harlem did not end with Brennan's departure. The police department continued to have officers who accepted bribes, who coordinated with organized crime, who treated black residents with contempt and violence. But the successful challenge to Brennan demonstrated that such corruption could be exposed and could result in consequences, and this understanding affected how officers operated and how residents approached police misconduct. The Harlem Community Legal Defense Fund, which Eleanor Whitmore had established as a vehicle for filing the initial complaint against Brennan, continued to represent residents in cases involving police misconduct. The organization filed additional complaints documenting patterns of abuse, selective enforcement, and corruption. Some of these complaints resulted in disciplinary action against officers. Others resulted in policy changes in how the police department handled complaints. The organization's work established precedents for challenging police conduct through legal channels. Reverend Hayes and the Greater Bethel AME Church continued to organize community meetings about police accountability. These meetings became a regular forum where Harlem residents could discuss experiences with law enforcement and could coordinate responses to misconduct. The meetings helped build collective understanding that police corruption was not inevitable and could be challenged through organized community action. Arthur Thompson's articles in the Amsterdam News established a model for investigative journalism about police corruption in black neighborhoods. Thompson continued to cover police misconduct in Harlem and in other parts of New York City. His reporting documented patterns of abuse and corruption that might otherwise have remained hidden. Other black newspapers adopted similar approaches, recognizing that media coverage could create pressure for accountability. The Harlem Ministers' Alliance, having successfully used its collective voice to demand investigation of Brennan, continued to address issues of police accountability and community safety. The Alliance issued statements about other cases of police misconduct, met with police department leadership to discuss community concerns, and provided moral authority to demands for reform. The Alliance's involvement in the Brennan case demonstrated that religious leaders could play important roles in challenging institutional corruption without endorsing criminal activity. For Lucky Luciano and his organization, Brennan's forced retirement represented a setback, but not a decisive defeat. Luciano lost a valuable source of police protection and coordination in Harlem. But Luciano's organization continued to operate gambling enterprises, continued to have corrupt relationships with other police officers, and continued to exert influence over parts of Harlem's illegal economy. The loss of one corrupt captain did not fundamentally alter the balance of power between Italian organized crime and black operators in Harlem. However, the Brennan case did establish that police officers who took orders from mob figures faced risks that previously might have seemed remote. Officers who observed Brennan's career destruction understood that corruption that became too visible could result in consequences even for high-ranking officials. This understanding did not eliminate police corruption, but it made officers more cautious about how openly they coordinated with organized crime figures. For Johnson personally, the successful challenge to Brennan enhanced his reputation within Harlem as someone who understood power dynamics and who could navigate complex institutional conflicts. Johnson had not operated as a simple enforcer using violence to solve problems. He had identified a strategic vulnerability, a corrupt police captain whose relationship with organized crime could be documented and exposed, and had built a coalition that could apply systematic pressure until institutional forces acted. This approach demonstrated sophistication that went beyond the stereotypes of criminal enforcers. The case also affected Johnson's relationship with Stephanie St. Clair. St. Clair recognized that Johnson had protected her operations by neutralizing a police captain who was coordinating enforcement actions with her Italian competitors. This demonstrated Johnson's value not just as muscle, but as a strategic thinker who could address threats through intelligence and organization rather than simply through violence. St. Clair increasingly relied on Johnson to handle complex problems that required strategic responses. When Dutch Schultz was assassinated in October 1935 on orders from Lucky Luciano, and when Luciano subsequently offered Johnson an arrangement whereby Johnson would control Harlem's rackets in exchange for paying a percentage to the Italian organization, Johnson's handling of the Brennan case likely influenced Luciano's assessment. Luciano recognized that Johnson was not simply a street operator who could be easily pushed aside or intimidated. Johnson had demonstrated capacity to expose corrupt police officers, to build community coalitions, to use legal and political channels to create institutional consequences. This made Johnson a more formidable figure than Luciano might have initially assumed, and it made Luciano more willing to negotiate a cooperative arrangement rather than attempting to take over Harlem's rackets by force. The story of Captain Brennan's forced retirement became part of Harlem's collective memory as an example of how institutional corruption could be challenged successfully. The details were often simplified in later retellings. A corrupt cop taking orders from the mob had been exposed and forced out. But the essential lesson remained that systematic documentation, coalition building, and pressure through multiple channels could produce accountability even when direct confrontation would have failed. For those who understood power dynamics, the case illustrated several principles. First, that institutional protection of corrupt individuals was not absolute. When corruption became too visible or too politically costly, institutions would sacrifice individuals to preserve organizational interests. Second, that pressure from multiple sources was more effective than pressure from a single source. Legal complaints alone might be ignored, but legal complaints combined with community organizing, media coverage, and religious leadership created cumulative effects that institutions could not easily dismiss. Third, and that strategic patience was more effective than impulsive action. The campaign against Brennan had taken 3 months of systematic effort, building evidence and pressure incrementally rather than demanding immediate results. When Bumpy Johnson died in July 1968, 32 years after the Brennan case, his obituaries in Harlem newspapers mentioned his long criminal career, but also his role in challenging corrupt police officers who served mob interests rather than community interests. The Brennan case was referenced as an example of Johnson's strategic intelligence and his understanding that power operates through systems rather than simply through individual actors. For historians and scholars who later examined police corruption in mid-20th century New York, and the Brennan case, when they could find documentation of it, represented a rare example of a black community successfully challenging a high-ranking corrupt police officer during an era when such challenges almost never succeeded. The case demonstrated that even in deeply racist institutional contexts, organized community action combined with strategic documentation could produce accountability. The case also illustrated the complex relationships between law enforcement, organized crime, and black communities in cities like New York during the mid-20th century. Police departments claimed authority to enforce laws and maintain order, but officers frequently operated as agents of organized crime rather than as public servants. Black communities faced the impossible choice of tolerating police corruption or challenging officers who had the power to arrest, brutalize, or kill community members with little accountability. The Brennan case showed that this impossible choice could sometimes be transcended through strategic action that made corruption too costly for institutions to protect. The quiet precision with which the Brennan case unfolded, systematic documentation, careful coalition building, pressure applied through legal and political channels rather than through violence, represented power at its most sophisticated. Johnson had understood that directly confronting a police captain would accomplish nothing. But creating conditions where the police department itself concluded that the captain had become a liability could force institutional action that personal confrontation never could. This understanding that institutions respond to calculations of costs and benefits rather than to justice or morality, and that creating sufficient costs can change institutional calculations, was the deeper lesson of the Brennan case. It was a lesson about how power actually operates in complex institutional environments and about how that understanding could be used to challenge seemingly entrenched corruption. The fact that Captain Brennan had been forced to choose between his relationship with Lucky Luciano's organization and his career, and that he had ultimately lost both, it demonstrated that strategic intelligence combined with systematic pressure could produce victories that direct force could never achieve. This was the essential story that remained in Harlem's memory, that a black enforcer working for a numbers operator had successfully forced out a corrupt police captain by building coalitions, documenting evidence, and understanding how institutions respond to political pressure. The victory had not come from violence or intimidation. It had come from strategic thinking, patience, and precise execution of a plan that attacked vulnerability rather than confronting strength.